I'm Anupam Sibal, and on behalf of the Apollo Center for Advanced Pediatrics, I'd like to thank you for partnering with us in the Apollo Center for Advanced Pediatrics educational series. In this series, we are attempting to have experts share their perspective on management of common pediatric problems. As a pediatric gastroenterologist, I will be making a presentation on the management of acute and chronic liver failure. We know that liver failure can either be acute or it can be chronic, and over the last decade there has been a tremendous amount of knowledge that has changed the way we look at these two separate types of failures and how we manage them. Going back to 1968, when Trey and Davidson first defined the onset of altered mental status within 8 weeks of initial symptoms in an otherwise healthy individual with no previous history of liver disease as fulminant hepatic failure. In 1993, O'Grady redefined this and actually defined and subclassified acute liver failure into three types. Hyperacute, where you get within 1 week of onset of symptoms the onset of encephalopathy. Acute, when that happens between 8 days and 28 days, and subacute, when encephalopathy sets in between 29 days to 12 weeks. In 2005, ASLD redefined acute liver failure as evidence of coagulation abnormality, usually an INR more than 1.5, and any degree of mental alteration in a patient without pre-existing cirrhosis and with an illness of 26 weeks duration. In 2006, the Pediatric Acute Liver Failure Study Group redefined acute liver failure as biochemical evidence of acute liver injury and hepatic-based coagulopathy defined as a prothrombin time of greater than equal to 15 seconds or an INR of more than 1.5 not corrected by vitamin K in the presence of clinical hepatic encephalopathy, or a prothrombin time of greater than equal to 20 seconds or an INR greater than equal to 2 regardless of the presence or absence of clinical hepatic encephalopathy. Now, this is very important, that you can actually make a definition of acute liver failure and a diagnosis of acute liver failure that ignores the presence of clinical hepatic encephalopathy, which was supposed to be an essential component of this disorder. Of course, there has to be no known evidence of chronic liver disease. And why was this change made in terms of not having hepatic encephalopathy when you have a PT of more than 20 seconds? Because sometimes in smaller babies and young infants, it is difficult to identify hepatic encephalopathy, and sometimes they do not have hepatic encephalopathy when acute liver failure sets in. So this definition is quite different to the conventional definition that we have been used to. We know that the etiology of acute liver failure in infants and neonates has a huge list of conditions: herpes, echo, adenovirus, hepatitis B sometimes, ischemic conditions such as congenital heart disease or post-cardiac surgery, myocarditis, asphyxia, metabolic conditions such as galactosemia, tyrosinemia type 1, neonatal hemochromatosis, and mitochondrial diseases. In older children, the etiology could be hepatitis A, B, or E, herpes virus, sepsis, Wilson's disease, hereditary fructose intolerance, autoimmune hepatitis. There is a long list of drugs and toxins: valproate, isoniazid, paracetamol, Amantia, and then there is a miscellaneous group which includes congenital heart disease, post-cardiac surgery, asphyxia, Budd-Chiari syndrome. Now, in our hospital, in the 14 years that we've been in existence with the liver unit at Apollo Delhi, we've had close to 3,400 patients, of which 1,686 have been due to acute liver disease, hepatitis A, typical hepatitis A 1,331, atypical hepatitis A about 200 plus, hepatitis E, hepatitis B, and acute presentation of Wilson's disease. We've had 129 children with acute liver failure. Hepatitis A is the commonest diagnosis, 61, cryptogenic 41, hep A and E together 11, A and B 6, E 6, hepatitis B 3, and poisoning 1. We also identified this very interesting group of children, 19 children who had fulminant hepatitis A and wherein the hepatitis A infection unmasked the G6PD deficiency. The mean age of these children was 7.8 years. The duration of symptoms 10 days. All these children had anemia, very high bilirubin. The mean was 56.8 with a range from 24.7 to as high as 87%. And in 11 out of these 19 children, there was a rapid rise in bilirubin, more than 10 in 24 hours, which is very difficult to explain just with a hepatitis virus. And there was a combination of hemolysis and the inflammation that the hepatitis virus had produced, which resulted in such a rise in bilirubin. What is the treatment of acute liver failure? Well, the treatment really is to allow sufficient time for recovery of functional critical cell mass and for the liver to make a recovery on its own. Management revolves around prevention of complications, and the list of complications is quite long. And if the complications set in, managing these complications. Of course, the only definitive treatment is liver transplantation. Just some bits on general management. It is nice to have a central venous access, have an arterial line. It's important not to have fluid overload. It's important to monitor sugars regularly. The head end of the bed should be elevated. We would electively intubate children with grade 3 encephalopathy. Sedation, if needed, we would use propofol, but of course if you need sedation, then this is a case for intubation. We need to do frequent neurological checks. Proton pump inhibitors or H2 blockers need to be used in every child because there is a very high risk of GI bleeding. Antibiotics, we tend to use cefotaxime and Metrogyl, but the risk of infection in these children is very, very high, in some series close to 100%. Mannitol judiciously. Lactulose to produce diarrhea. It's important if lactulose is used to use it in appropriate doses and not very small doses that actually does very little. So sometimes one would have to give as much as 15 to 20 ml of lactulose every 2 hours. N-acetylcysteine, which is the antidote for paracetamol poisoning, has also been found to be useful in non-paracetamol acute liver failure, and it has a variety of ways with which it has been shown to have beneficial effects. There's been a lot of interest in developing non-biological filtration techniques, hemofiltration, hemoperfusion, exchange transfusion. All three have been found not to be useful. There's been a lot of interest in an albumin dialysis, which is referred to as MARS, and what we have here is an albumin circuit, and this helps remove some of the toxins that are bound to albumin, and it is combined with a conventional dialysis machine. Of course, there is very limited evidence to support the use of MARS in acute liver failure, and the only benefit that it has is that it serves as a bridge to transplantation. There's been interest in developing an artificial liver, and this is a prototype, one of the European prototypes, which has hepatocytes that are lined in the cartridge, which we can see at the bottom. The blood from the patient goes through this and goes back, and the hepatocytes are thought, or the premise is that the hepatocytes would detoxify the blood that passes through them. Again, it's really early days in terms of how useful this is. So when we talk about liver transplantation, there are three key questions that need to be answered. Is there a chance for spontaneous recovery? Is a transplant feasible? Or have irreversible complications occurred? You don't want to transplant a child if there is a chance of spontaneous recovery, and you don't want to transplant a child if irreversible complications have occurred. So there has to be a very judicious decision made in the window period that these children offer, and this window period is usually a few hours to a day. The King's College criteria for liver transplantation in non-paracetamol causes was first described in 1989. A prothrombin time of more than 100 seconds or three of the following: bilirubin of more than 17.5, age less than 10 or more than 40, PT of more than 50, symptoms to encephalopathy more than 7 days, non-A, non-B or drug-induced liver failure. For paracetamol overdose, a pH of less than 7.3 or the following three factors: PT of more than 100, creatinine of more than 3.5 or grade 3 or grade 4 encephalopathy. We do not see very much of paracetamol poisoning. In fact, we've only seen 2 patients, but it is a common cause. In fact, the commonest cause of acute liver failure in Great Britain, where girls would typically consume a large amount of paracetamol and would then end up with liver failure. We had one adult patient who after a fight with her husband took 70 tablets of paracetamol and landed in the emergency with acute liver and renal failure. And we were very surprised why she took paracetamol, because it's not a commonly used drug. But this was because she had grown up in England and had read a lot of stories about girls trying to commit suicide by having paracetamol. Well, what happened in this young lady's case was that her husband dutifully donated the right lobe of his liver, and they lived happily for about 2 years till they got divorced. There's been interest in developing single variable prognostic models, use of serum GC globulin, blood lactate, phosphate, blood ammonia, alpha fetoprotein, prothrombin time alone, or factor V. All of them are promising but have not yet been proven in multiple studies to be as good as the criteria that I just shared with you. There's interest in the Apache 2 score and also liver injury units, but again we need more evidence. In 2011, a paper got published from King's College where they looked at 4 parameters: INR greater than or equal to 4, bilirubin more than 13, age less than 2, and a WBC count of more than 9,000 as predictors. And they found that with an INR of more than 4, they could correctly classify who needs a liver transplant in more than 90% of the patients. For children who present with fulminant Wilson's, there is a Wilson's disease score index developed in 1986, but now there is a newer index which looks at 5 parameters: bilirubin, INR, AST, white cell count and albumin, and a score of more than or equal to 11 has a sensitivity of 92% and specificity of 97%. We at Apollo have been using an INR of 4, and this has worked well for us. While there is no accepted definition of chronic liver failure is believed to have set in when there is development of cirrhosis and its complications such as malnutrition, portal hypertension, bleeding, esophageal varices, ascites, encephalopathy, or hepatorenal syndrome. End-stage chronic liver failure is associated with the loss of synthetic function of the liver, which is manifest with a low albumin and a prolonged prothrombin time. Well, we are all familiar with what we find when we see a child with chronic liver failure in terms of the physical manifestation from malnutrition to bruising to evidence of hypersplenism, clubbing, loss of fat stores, rickets, hypotonia. The etiology: cholestatic liver disease manifests itself as biliary atresia in the first few weeks to months of life, Alagille syndrome, which is the paucity of bile ducts associated with classical other features of Alagilles, familial intrahepatic cholestasis, non-syndromic paucity of intrahepatic bile ducts, idiopathic giant cell neonatal hepatitis, chronic hepatitis, post-viral B and C, autoimmune liver disease, fibropolycystic liver disease, sometimes associated with kidney problems, primary immunodeficiency, and NASH, which is becoming a significant problem as we see an increase in obesity in children. The list of metabolic liver disease is very long, includes Wilson's, tyrosinemia type 1. Alpha-1 antitrypsin is the commonest cause of liver disease in the Caucasian population, but we don't really see it that often. Cystic fibrosis is very, very rare in India, and glycogen storage disease in the different subtypes is seen in parts of the country. We've seen 446 children with chronic liver disease. Hepatitis B is the commonest, 189, followed by unknown at 97. Hepatitis C, 68. Most of these children have had multiple blood transfusions and includes a large subgroup of patients with thalassemia. 31 children with Wilson's, 26 with choledochal cyst, 18 autoimmune hepatitis, and 17 are others. For hepatitis B, there is a clear protocol now in terms of who should be treated. If there is acute viral replication, which means that either hepatitis B E antigen positivity is present or the DNA levels are high, more than 10 raised to power 5 copies per ml or 20,000 international units per ml, and the enzymes are high, then we would want to treat. If there is no hepatic decompensation, one can wait for about 3 months and then consider therapy. But if of course there is hepatic decompensation, then one should treat these children as soon as possible. If the ALT is less than 2 times the upper level, then it's best to observe these children because the current therapy that we have is not likely to be effective. If there is just an Australia antigen positivity and no active viral replication, these children should just be under observation and follow up. What are the treatment options? Well, there is interferon, there is lamivudine, there is idefovir, there is telbuvudine and entecavir. Interferon is the standard therapy for use between 6 months to 1 year. Lamivudine and some of the other oral antivirals have been studied, but the problem with them is a resistance that actually sets in after they've been in use for about a year or so. Very little is known about telbuvudine and entecavir, but more data will become available in the next 12 to 24 months. So as of now, the only recommended treatment outside clinical trials is interferon. For hepatitis C, which was only identified in 1989, there is a lot more clarity in terms of treatment. To make a diagnosis, one must have, in addition to hepatitis C antibody positivity, positive HCV RNA. It's helpful to determine a genotype because the success of treatment does vary with the type of genotype 2 or 3. The treatment is standard, which is pegylated interferon with ribavirin at 15 milligrams per kilogram per day for 24 weeks. And HCV RNA should be done at 24 weeks to establish the end of treatment response. And if RNA is still positive, treatment has failed, and then one can move on to second line drugs. And of course, if HCV RNA is not detected, then one has achieved what we had set out to achieve. For autoimmune hepatitis, the standard therapy is prednisolone along with azathioprine. It's been shown that it's important to add azathioprine because once one tapers prednisolone, quite often there is a relapse. Liver transplant is required in certain cases. For Wilson's disease, treatment is very standard: D-penicillamine along with zinc, treatment of choice, trientine if there is a problem with penicillamine in terms of side effects. Galactosemia, standard therapy in terms of changing the formula, and of course lifelong adherence to the special diet. For bile acid synthetic defects, specific treatment is the use of bile salts. For tyrosinemia type 1, while the only definitive treatment was liver transplantation, in the last decade this has changed, and now with the availability of NTBC and a combination of the right diet, a few children need liver transplantation. It's only indicated if there is no response to NTBC or malignancies been found to develop in these children, and then one would have to transplant them. It's very important to focus on appropriate nutritional support, increase the calories 130 to 150% of the requirement, appropriate protein. It's important to give branch chain amino acids. Sometimes albumin might be needed when you have ascites and you're working up the child and waiting for a transplant. It's important to give fat in the ratio of MCT, LCT of 50-50 with essential fatty acids thrown in, and important to supplement with fat soluble and water soluble vitamins. There's been a lot of advancement in the development of endoscopic therapy, and here we can see huge varices with cherry red spots, and these can of course be life-threatening. With endoscopic variceal ligation, one can actually put bands, and you can see 3 varices with bands, and this has now overtaken sclerotherapy. The advantage of band ligation is that you need fewer sessions, fewer complications, lower rebleeding rate. There is also an advancement in terms of managing gastric varices with the use of tissue glue or adhesives. For patients who require shunt, LR shunt is the effective treatment for extrahepatic portal venous obstruction. It deals with both GI bleeds and hypersplenism, and rebleeding is rare. The standard therapy now in patients with end-stage chronic liver failure is liver transplantation. The liver comes in 8 segments, and each of these segments has their own blood supply and biliary drainage, so it's possible to actually remove segment 5, 6, 7, 8 of the right lobe and transplant it, or use segment 2, 3, 4, which is the whole left lobe, or segment 2, 3, or just a segment 3 graft. The clinical indicators for need for a transplant: recurrent variceal bleeding, refractory ascites, intractable pruritus, growth retardation, and unacceptable quality of life in children with progressive familial intrahepatic cholestasis, where the pruritus alone makes life really miserable. The lab indicators: an INR of more than 1.4, indirect bilirubin of more than 6, low albumin, low cholesterol. How successful is liver transplantation? Well, this is data from the European registry, and you actually see that whether you're transplanted before the age of 2 or between the age of 2 and 15, it doesn't really have any impact. Long-term survival is close to 75% at 10 years. This is data from Birmingham, and again you notice here that the survival figures are excellent. In biliary atresia, close to 90%. Fulminant dropped down to 60%, but for the vast majority it's 80%. Pittsburgh has experience of pediatric liver transplantation over 20 years, and they have 20-year survival figures of 65 and 64%, and again no significant difference based on the age at which you're transplanted. So liver transplantation is effective treatment with good long-term outcome. When we first started talking about need for liver transplantation in India, there were 3 questions that were posed. Is there actually a need? And even if there is a need, why do we have to transplant them in India? Why don't we send them abroad? And the third question is it really possible to set up an indigenous program? In this paper that was published from SGPGI in 1999, 30% of patients presenting there needed a liver transplant. Roughly 1 to 2 million per million population is the need for liver transplantation in pediatrics. So with our population of 1.2 billion, we would need about 2,500 children who would need a transplant each year. In our experience, out of the 3,400 patients that we've seen, roughly 11% satisfied need for a transplant. Neonatal cholestasis with the vast majority, with biliary atresia being the commonest etiology. Fulminant hepatic failure was the next common, followed by unknown. Then metabolic in Wilson's, PFIC, some malignancies like hepatoblastoma, hepatocellular carcinoma, tyrosinemia, Crigler-Najjar syndrome, Budd-Chiari, and congenital hepatic fibrosis. So clearly there is a need for facilities for liver transplantation in India. Well, we could send them abroad. The cost would be between 80 lakhs to 1.5 crores, additional cost of waiting, long waiting period, and of course for a cadaver we would be the last priority. We attempted the first pediatric transplant in 98. It was a cadaver which sadly did not work with the graft not functioning well. In November 98 we performed the first successful pediatric liver transplant. In 1999 the first successful transplant for fulminant hepatic failure. In 2002 the first successful liver transplant, which was a retransplant, the first cadaver pediatric in 2007, and in 2008 the youngest in India. We've performed a total of 63 transplants, of which biliary atresia has been 23, and then a variety of indications: PFIC, cryptogenic, fulminant, Wilson's, Budd-Chiari, congenital hepatic fibrosis, neonatal hepatitis, tyrosinemia, portal vein thrombosis, which was a retransplant, Hep C, HCC, Crigler-Najjar, rat poisoning, and autoimmune hepatitis. This is Sanjay, the first child in India to have received a successful liver transplant. This was him pre-transplant, severely malnourished, jaundiced, failed Kasai, biliary atresia at 18 months. This is him at discharge. This is him 4 years later. This is him 8 years later. This is him 10 years later. And this is him 12 years later. This is one of our smaller kids at 7 months transplanted, him about a year later, 2 years later. This child from Kolkata with biliary atresia, failed Kasai, became the youngest child to be transplanted at the age of 6 months, 6 days. This is him 6 months later. This is him a year and a half later. This is a child who needed a retransplant. This is a child we airlifted from Nepal with Wilson's disease. This is him when he passed his class 10 exams. It's the first child from Cambodia to be transplanted. He had his initial surgery for biliary atresia in Singapore. This is him a year later. This is a child with Crigler-Najjar syndrome from Qatar. You can see that she's under a phototherapy unit, deeply jaundiced. This is her 3 months later after a successful transplant 2 years later. This child is from Pakistan, from Lahore. There's Wilson's disease in the family, and the Chief Minister of Pakistan, Punjab, actually wrote to Mrs. Sonia Gandhi to sponsor his transplant, and this is him just before he went back to Pakistan. Here's another child from Pakistan, biliary atresia, who needed a liver transplant and doing well. And you notice there You can't really see it very well. He says, Sachin, see you in Lahore. This child had a very simple desire. He wanted to play cricket with Sachin Tendulkar before his transplant. Fortunately for him and for us, the Indian cricket team was in Delhi, and he actually met Sachin, played cricket with him the night before his transplant for about an hour, and then got transplanted successfully. This is the first child from Iraq with PFIC to be transplanted. This is the same child after discharge. This is a child from Palestine with Budd-Chiari syndrome, and this is him with his family after the transplant. This is a child from UAE, biliary atresia, failed Kasai, post-transplant, him 6 months later. And this is a child from Herat in Afghanistan with congenital hepatic fibrosis, doing well post-transplant. Child from Bangladesh, failed Kasai. This is her a year later. For us, the watershed came in 2007. Till then, the patients would get referred very late, as a result of which very few were fit. And of the ones who were fit, very few were willing for a transplant because they didn't have faith that liver transplantation would work. So in that phase, we transplanted 14 children and 88 adults. After 2007, we get referrals early. Most of those who are referred are fit, and most of those who are fit are willing for a transplant. We performed 49 transplants in this phase with 453 adults. Last year we performed 775 liver and kidney transplants across the group, and this year we've been performing about 6 liver transplants in adults and children every week. So what has contributed to success? Greater surgical expertise, better intra and post-operative monitoring, improvements in intensive care, standardized post-transplant care, and better management of immunosuppression. There's a lot of awareness now about transplantation, both in the public and the medical community. As outcomes have improved, we've expanded the indications. We are happy to transplant smaller babies, and there's greater acceptance, and we've been able to bring down the cost to 12 to 15 lakhs. As we complete a decade, we can say with satisfaction that we've been able to help a fair number of children, but of course we need to bridge this gap. There are lots of children who need liver transplantation, and we've been only able to help a few, but we have a positive trend. This child needed a liver transplant. The family had a donor but didn't have the money, so we put out an appeal on one of the television channels, and a cricketer came forward and donated money for his lifelong immunosuppression and transplant, and this is this child post-transplant 2 years later. So I think what our limited experience shows, that it's possible to set up a liver transplant program using Indian skills, Indian minds, Indian infrastructure, and I believe that in today's world we can offer hope to children with liver failure. Thank you very much for your attention.